When you're ready to start.
I am ready. All right, so we'll do the story about Doc. You want to
Doc.
chronologically, like how it all
Uh-huh.
unfolded.
Just tell me when to start.
You can start.
Oh, I first met Doc about 30 years ago. Doc is a B-29 that um, has a tail number, not that anybody really cares, but has a tail number of 44-6992. It's like its serial number. Doc was manufactured, rolled off the assembly line in December of 1944, was turned over to the Air Force in 1945. How Doc got his name is that he was one of 9 B-29s that was built as a radar picket aircraft. So it wasn't intended to drop bombs. It was intended to provide a mobile radar. So why the name Doc? Turns out if you go back and listen to your childhood stories, there were 7 dwarfs, and each dwarf had a name. There was Snow White, and there was a Wicked Witch. So that makes 9. So they gave each one a name, and the aircraft we're talking about was named Doc. And I have no idea what happened to the other aircraft in the group. Probably some of them ended up at China Lake and were destroyed in testing. But Doc had active service from the spring of 1945 till for about 10 years. Then was flown to China Lake and towed to what we used to call the boneyard. The boneyard was just where they stored obsolete aircraft until they needed them for testing. Then they would roll them to the test area and test whatever weapons against it they were testing. But Doc was at the end of the line, and they never got to Doc. And although there were a lot of B-29s built, they were in service for a relatively short period of time, and most of the B-29s were destroyed, and they were, of course, built by Boeing. So at some point, somebody said, gee, it would be nice to have a flying example. So they went to China Lake, and they found a B-29 that had not been shot up, and they set about restoring it. But that wasn't Doc. That was an aircraft that was taken by what was then the Confederate Air Force. To be politically correct, they changed their name to the Consolidated Air Force, I think they're called now, whatever, but got rid of the name Confederate. And that was the only flyable B-29 for a long time. A man named Tony Mazalinsky wanted to have a second B-29 that was flyable. He knew there was one at China Lake in the boneyard, and so he set about trying to get that B-29. And the Navy told him, we will sign that over to you if you can provide us a flyable B-25 that was that the Navy used during the war, and were also in hard to find. And he literally searched the world, found a B-29 that was repairable in South America. So he had that B-29 disassembled, moved to the United States, thought it would take a year or so to rehabilitate it. Turned out it was more like 6 years. But finally he had a flyable flyable B-25 of the correct model, painted properly, whatnot. And so the Navy said, okay, you sign that over to us and we'll sign Doc over to you. And Doc had been sitting in the boneyard for, at that time, about 40 years. Much of the glass components were either taken. It turns out that the domes where they would take star fixes for navigation apparently made pretty good punch bowls. So the aircraft was stripped of those. The glass was just broken out, and so local creatures inhabited, entered, made a nice protected nest, and it was also used to store they'd throw junk that they didn't want to leave laying around. So the bomb bays were full of junk, and the aircraft was in terrible shape. I got to crawl around on Doc at the beginning of this project, before it was in any way rehabilitated. And it was fascinating because the B-29 had, of course, large bomb bays, but you could get from the front of the aircraft to the back of the aircraft through what amounted to a tube about maybe 2.5 feet in diameter. So you would have to crawl the length of the bomb bays to get back to where the tail gun position was and the like. And so we were out there one day. Actually, I need to correct that story. We'd already moved it to Inyokern Airport, and there was a bunch of volunteers that were taking the propellers off. It turns out if it ever comes up in jeopardy, a B-29 propeller weighs 950 pounds. And there is a tool that you have to have to to remove the nut that holds the propeller. It has no other use. There's nothing else it's used for. Somebody, of course, at China Lake had one. And so we got, one of the engines didn't have a propeller. So we got the 3 propellers off, and they said, okay, you guys are done for the day. I mean, we accomplished our work. And so I then crawled around the B-29 and kind of examined it. Like I said, it was in terrible shape. There were rodents in it and all kinds of things. The plan was, it had been moved at that point from about 25 miles from the from the boneyard to Inyokern Airport. And it was at Inyokern Airport originally. The plan was to restore it there. Well, they didn't have the facilities. At some point, they disassembled it, moved it to Wichita, Kansas, where it had been built, and retired Boeing workers took over the job of rehabilitating it. And it was a fairly massive job. It took 450,000 total work hours to get it from China Lake Boneyard to the condition where it was flyable.
Going back to the China Lake Boneyard, wasn't there, like, you had to use railroad ties, or how did you guys get it out of the boneyard?
Oh, yeah. Well, there was a part of the, in the course of moving it, we had to get it across something called Dixie Wash. Dixie Wash was maybe, I don't know, 8 or 10 feet deep, maybe 30 feet wide, but there was no way around it. There was no way to get dock from where it was to Inyokern Airport without crossing Dixie Wash. So that represented a challenge. The way the challenge was dealt with was there is a railroad that runs from Trona, California to Mojave, California. That's the total 60 miles. That's the total railroad. And it does one thing. It transports potash from Trona Lake, from Cyril's Dry Lake, to the railhead at Mojave. Then the train goes back, picks up more, makes that run a gajillion times. And so at one point, they were replacing the ties. And 60 miles is a lot of ties. And so somebody managed to talk them into donating the ties. And what we did was we filled in Dixie Wash in 3 places. One for each of the main landing gear and one for the nose gear, for the steerable gear. And so it was towed across Dixie Wash because the one for the steerable gear was wide enough for a tow motor. And so it was towed across. They also had to get it to Inyokern Airport, they had to cross U.S. Highway 395. And so...
Did they fill the ditch with the
They,
railroad ties?
yeah, I was part of the crew that moved the railroad ties. They don't look heavy as you're driving down the highway and look over at the railroad tracks running next to it. They're a lot heavier than they look. And they teamed me up with my next door neighbor who used to, had 2 things that he did in life. One was he slept, and the other one was he worked out in his gym, which we could see from our house. And he was strong as an ox. So naturally they paired me with a guy who was strong as an ox. So we moved a lot of railroad ties.
Which neighbor was it?
I don't actually remember his name. He was single.
Across the street from us?
No. The house on the corner next to our house.
Oh, the one that was on the corner of Rancho and, what was that? No,
Church, yeah. And so we got the ties in place. I think they also had to be removed as well. And so anyhow, we had to get it across US 395. And of course, there was a street light that prevented that. Well, of course, they just temporarily removed the street light. I got to take this.